The neighborhood had always seemed perfectly ordinary, a quiet subdivision of identical beige houses with trimmed lawns, pristine driveways, and a homeowners association that prided itself on order and compliance. Residents often whispered about the HOA obsessive attention to detail, the way they policed paint colors, fence heights, and landscaping choices, as if their lives depended on it. Among these homes stood one anomaly, a stone wall built decades earlier by a local craftsman whose name had long been forgotten by most, but whose handiwork had endured the wear of time with grace and artistry. The wall stretched across the edge of the property, its irregular stones forming intricate patterns, its age lending it a sense of solemn dignity. To casual eyes, it might have seemed old, fashioned, or even slightly out of place, but to those who appreciated craftsmanship, it was a masterpiece. The homeowner, a retired architect named Elaine, had always treated it with reverence, maintaining the stones and repairing weathered sections with care. Elaine understood the wall's value beyond mere aesthetics. It represented a piece of local history, a tangible connection to the neighborhood's past. For years, it had been the subject of quiet admiration from passers-by, often overlooked by those who didn't notice the delicate patterns and the way the sunlight highlighted the texture of each stone. Then one morning, Elaine returned home to find an official notice slipped under her door, stamped with the HOA emblem, warning her that her stone wall violated community standards. According to the notice, the wall did not conform to the HOA height regulations. Its irregular construction was considered an eyesore, and failure to comply would result in substantial fines. She initially thought it was a bureaucratic mistake. The wall had existed long before the HOA had imposed its modern rules, and it had never been the subject of complaints. But the letter was stern, listing a deadline for the wall's removal or modification. Elaine attempted to reach out to the HOA for clarification, sending polite letters and emails explaining the wall's history and unique craftsmanship. Her requests were ignored or met with vague assurances that someone would look into it, but no action ever materialized. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure mounted. One morning, Elaine returned home to find heavy machinery at the edge of her property, the familiar stones of her wall being disassembled and hauled away by workers who claimed to be following HOA orders. The noise was deafening, the sight unbearable. Stones that had stood for generations were reduced to rubble, their arrangement destroyed without warning or explanation. She watched helplessly, feeling a mixture of anger, despair, and disbelief, knowing that the wall could never be restored to its original glory. The neighbors watched in silence, some sympathetic, some fearful of angering the HOA themselves. Rumors began to circulate about the HOA decision-making process, the unchecked power they wielded, and the harsh enforcement of rules with little regard for history or personal property. Elaine documented the destruction with photos and notes, but she had no idea that what had happened that morning would trigger consequences far beyond her own misfortune. She spent the next few days combing through local archives, historical registries, and city records, searching for any mention of the stone wall. That's when she stumbled upon something shocking. The wall was listed as a registered historical landmark, recognized by the city as part of the neighborhood's cultural heritage. Elaine could barely comprehend the discovery. The very entity that had demolished her property, the HOA, had unknowingly violated a law that carried serious legal and financial ramifications. The realization brought a complex mix of vindication and outrage. On one hand, the destruction of the wall was irreversible, a tangible loss of history. On the other hand, the fact that the HOA had acted without researching its own community rules and historical registries opened the door to consequences they could not have anticipated. Elaine began to understand that this situation would not only redefine her relationship with the HOA, but also potentially shake the foundations of their authority. The story of the stone wall, which had been quietly admired for decades, was about to become a catalyst for conflict, legal battles, and public scrutiny. And so, as she stared at the pile of rubble where the wall once stood, Elaine made a decision. She would not let this injustice pass unchallenged, unaware that the ensuing events would expose secrets, negligence, and the harsh reality of what happens when power is exercised without knowledge. Care. This was only the beginning, and the next chapters of the story would reveal just how far the HOA mistakes could reach, threatening not only their reputation, but their financial stability and control over the neighborhood. The calm of the subdivision had been shattered, and Elaine's quiet determination promised that the conflict was far from over. Elaine spent the following days in a whirlwind of research, documentation, and quiet fury. The initial shock of witnessing her stone wall reduced to rubble had begun to settle, replaced by a simmering determination to uncover the truth behind the HOA reckless actions. Every morning, she pored over city records, historical archives, and property registries, uncovering a meticulous record of her home and the stone wall as a designated historical landmark. The wall had been recognized decades earlier for its craftsmanship, cultural significance, and contribution to the architectural heritage of the neighborhood. It was listed under multiple city protection programs, its destruction not only a violation of HOA rules, but also a breach of local and state historical preservation laws. Elaine realized the full weight of the situation. The HOA had acted blindly, arrogantly enforcing their petty rules without conducting the simplest background checks, and in doing so, they had exposed themselves to legal liability that could dwarf any fines they had ever imposed on residents. She began organizing her evidence carefully, photographing the ruins of the wall from every angle, collecting correspondence from the HOA, and making detailed notes of dates, times, and the identities of the workers who had carried out the demolition. The more she delved into the records, the more glaring the HOA negligence became. Their bylaws mandated a review process for any construction or modification within the neighborhood, including checks against city codes and historical preservation guidelines. They had skipped every step, acting as judge, jury, and executioner in a matter of hours, leaving destruction in their wake. Elaine's mind raced as she imagined the HOA board members, confident in their authority, blissfully unaware that their own actions could soon lead to ruin. The thought was intoxicating, yet tempered by a sobering reality. She had lost a part of her home, a symbol of heritage and artistry that could never be truly replaced. Anger coexisted with the resolve to ensure that justice was served. She began preparing a formal complaint to the city's Historical Preservation Office, detailing the wall's significance, the HOA actions, and the immediate need for accountability. Elaine included documentation proving the wall's registered landmark status, photographs of the destruction, and a timeline showing how the HOA had ignored warnings and official procedures. The city's office responded with urgency, acknowledging the seriousness of the violation and promising an immediate investigation. Within days, inspectors were dispatched to her property, measuring, cataloging, and assessing the extent of the damage. The neighborhood, once calm and orderly, now buzzed with gossip and speculation. Neighbors who had previously avoided confrontation began whispering about the HOA overreach, sharing their own minor grievances, and quietly siding with Elaine. Some expressed fear that if the HOA could act so recklessly against a long-standing property feature, no one was safe from their authoritarian tendencies. Others were emboldened, recognizing a chance to challenge rules they had quietly resented for years. Elaine, meanwhile, began to receive attention from local media. A reporter had caught wind of the story through community tips and arrived at her home, eager to capture images of the destroyed wall and document the unfolding conflict. The reporter described the wall as a symbol of historical craftsmanship and local heritage, senselessly destroyed by an HOA acting without oversight or knowledge. Elaine felt a mixture of vindication and unease as cameras flashed, her private loss now public spectacle. She knew the exposure could accelerate consequences for the HOA, yet the thought of strangers scrutinizing the ruins of her cherished wall added another layer of emotional complexity to the ordeal. The HOA board members, when confronted with the growing media attention, attempted damage control. They issued public statements claiming ignorance of the wall's status, portraying the demolition as a necessary enforcement action against a non-compliant structure. Internally, however, panic rippled through their ranks. Emails leaked, revealing board discussions filled with confusion, fear, and desperate attempts to justify their actions. The more Elaine uncovered, the more it became clear that the HOA had acted impulsively, arrogantly assuming that their authority was absolute, and in doing so, they had exposed themselves to consequences they had never anticipated. The city's investigation intensified. Inspectors examined the remaining stones, assessing whether the wall could be partially reconstructed, and reviewed records of the HOA communication with Elaine. It became apparent that the demolition had been carried out without proper permits, without a historical review, and in direct violation of both city preservation statutes and the HOA own bylaws. The implications were staggering. Legal experts consulted by Elaine began outlining potential avenues for restitution and accountability. The HOA could face heavy fines, mandatory restoration orders, and even lawsuits from residents if the board's negligence was found to have breached fiduciary duties. The financial and reputational damage threatened to destabilize the association entirely. As the investigation progressed, Elaine noticed a shift in the neighborhood's atmosphere. Residents who had previously been passive began speaking up, some cautiously, others with surprising boldness. The story of the demolished wall became a touchstone for frustration with the HOA authoritarian style, highlighting a pattern of overreach and lack of transparency. Small acts of resistance appeared, such as neighbors documenting their own properties, sharing historical details, and questioning HOA mandates that had been unquestioned for years. The community that had once been silenced by fear of fines and retribution was awakening, galvanized by the egregious error that had destroyed something irreplaceable. Elaine herself became a reluctant leader in this informal movement. She organized meetings to inform neighbors of their rights, explained the legal implications of the HOA actions, and encouraged documentation of any similar overreach. Each day brought new insights into the HOA inner workings, revealing patterns of negligence, ignorance, and unchecked authority. It became clear that the organization had long operated under the assumption that fear and strict enforcement would suffice to maintain compliance, never accounting for the possibility of historical or legal oversight. Meanwhile, the media coverage amplified the story beyond the neighborhood. Local news outlets picked up the tale, framing it as a cautionary example of overzealous HOA enforcement clashing with historical preservation. Social media posts, photos, and videos went viral, drawing attention from historians, architects, and civic activists. The narrative was compelling: a beloved stone wall, destroyed without permission by a governing body blind to its own regulations, highlighting both the importance of preserving history and the dangers of unbridled authority. The HOA board, now facing public scrutiny, attempted to salvage their image. Meetings were held behind closed doors, legal counsel was consulted, and emergency sessions were called to devise a strategy for restitution. Some board members advocated for offering Elaine compensation or attempting reconstruction of the wall, but the complexity and cost of such efforts were daunting. Others argued for denial and minimization, hoping the public attention would fade. The tension within the board mirrored the escalating tension in the neighborhood, with fear and blame circulating like wildfire. Legal notices began arriving for the HOA, citing violations of historical preservation laws and demanding accountability. Fines were levied, initially moderate but growing as investigators determined the full scope of the infraction. Experts calculated the costs of reconstructing the wall, the penalties for unauthorized demolition, and potential lawsuits from residents who felt threatened by the HOA unilateral actions. The numbers were staggering, potentially reaching hundreds of thousands of dollars, a financial strain few on the board had anticipated. Elaine, however, remained steadfast. Her mission was not personal vengeance, but the protection of heritage and the assertion of accountability. Each document she submitted, each photo she cataloged, strengthened the case against the HOA. The realization that she was standing on the precipice of a larger movement, one that could redefine the power dynamics in the neighborhood, lent her both courage and purpose. In the weeks that followed, the HOA mistakes began to cascade. Public opinion, legal pressure, and neighborhood unrest coalesced into a storm the board could not control. Meetings became heated, statements more defensive, and internal communications more frantic. Every decision or indecision threatened to escalate the situation further. Elaine watched as the organization she had once considered untouchable revealed vulnerabilities she had long suspected existed. The city's inspectors concluded their assessment, confirming that the stone wall's destruction was a clear violation of preservation statutes, and that the HOA had acted without legal authority. Their report recommended immediate restitution, fines, and mandatory training for HOA board members on historical preservation compliance. It was a decisive blow, signaling that the HOA actions would not go unchecked. Elaine's story was no longer a private grievance. It had become a symbol of the intersection between authority, negligence, and historical preservation. The neighborhood, once silent under the weight of strict governance, now found its voice. Residents discussed strategies for oversight, shared stories of past grievances, and considered formal challenges to the board's authority. The destruction of the wall had ignited a movement, and Elaine, unwilling to let the injustice fade, became its focal point. And yet, despite the momentum, the human element remained complex. Elaine grappled with her own feelings of loss, the permanence of what had been destroyed, and the challenge of turning personal tragedy into meaningful change. She realized that even as the HOA faced consequences, the emotional and historical loss could never be fully remedied. The story of the stone wall was now entwined with the narrative of the neighborhood itself, a cautionary tale of pride, neglect, and the price of unchecked authority. As the chapter of investigation and public exposure closed, the next phase loomed: legal action, financial reckoning, and the unmasking of the HOA internal failures. Elaine's resolve had only strengthened, knowing that the HOA had underestimated the consequences of their blind enforcement, and that their arrogance had set into motion events far beyond their control. The rubble of the wall stood as a silent witness, a reminder of what had been lost and what could still be recovered through accountability and determination. The neighborhood had shifted, the balance of power disrupted, and the story was far from over. Elaine's journey, fueled by knowledge, persistence, and a refusal to accept injustice, was only beginning to reveal the true consequences of the HOA catastrophic mistake. The legal storm hit the HOA like a tidal wave, sweeping away any illusions of control or authority they had previously enjoyed. Notices piled up on the board members' desks, each one a stark reminder of the consequences of their reckless decision to demolish Elaine's stone wall. The fines alone were staggering, accumulating daily as city officials calculated penalties for every statute the HOA had violated. The board scrambled to contain the damage, hiring lawyers at exorbitant hourly rates and attempting to craft a narrative of ignorance, hoping that claiming "we didn't know" would shield them from financial ruin. But ignorance was no defense. Elaine's meticulous documentation, combined with city records proving the wall's landmark status, left little room for argument. The inspectors' reports were damning, detailing the extent of the violation, the historical significance of the wall, and the failure of the HOA to conduct even the most basic due diligence before ordering the demolition. As each report arrived, the board's panic deepened. Emails between members grew frantic, shifting blame, questioning decisions, and revealing a shocking level of incompetence. Some admitted privately that they had acted without consulting anyone, while others claimed they had been pressured by higher authorities within the board to resolve the eyesore problem quickly. The public exposure of these internal communications only fueled the growing anger of the neighborhood. Elaine, meanwhile, became a central figure in the unfolding drama. Local news outlets ran follow-up stories, framing her as the homeowner who stood up to an overreaching HOA and defended the cultural heritage of the community. Social media amplified the narrative, with posts showing before and after images of the demolished wall going viral. The neighborhood became a hive of discussion, neighbors sharing their own grievances with HOA policies, and many realizing that Elaine's struggle was a mirror of their own suppressed frustrations. The financial implications for the HOA were immediate and severe. Fines for demolishing a registered landmark were calculated not just as a punitive measure, but as a deterrent, emphasizing the seriousness of the violation. The board realized that their annual budget, previously considered sufficient for landscaping, maintenance, and minor improvements, could not possibly cover the penalties now levied against them. They began exploring insurance claims, hoping that their policies would provide some relief. What they discovered was horrifying. The insurance specifically excluded willful or negligent acts, leaving the board personally liable for a large portion of the fines. The panic escalated further when Elaine's attorney suggested the possibility of suing the HOA for damages, citing the emotional distress caused by the destruction, the irreparable loss of a historical structure, and the violation of legal protections. While Elaine made it clear that her priority was accountability and restoration, the board realized they were facing not just city fines, but the prospect of significant civil liability. Meetings among board members became tense, often ending with no consensus, as each person feared being held personally responsible. Accusations flew, and alliances shifted, revealing fractures that had always existed beneath the surface of the seemingly unified board. The community watched these developments with growing interest and satisfaction. Neighbors who had once been intimidated by fines and the HOA authoritarian presence now felt empowered. They documented minor infractions, questioned enforcement policies, and organized informal committees to monitor board actions. The destruction of the wall had ignited a spark that threatened to transform the neighborhood's relationship with its governing body permanently. Meanwhile, Elaine focused on ensuring that the process remained legal, ethical, and well documented. She gathered historians, architects, and legal experts to provide testimony on the wall's significance. Their assessments were thorough, detailing the craftsmanship, cultural context, and historical importance of each stone, making it impossible for the HOA to claim that the structure was insignificant or replaceable. The experts' reports underscored that the wall was not just an aesthetic feature, but a legally protected piece of heritage, and any attempt to reconstruct it without proper methods would violate preservation standards. The media coverage intensified, with news segments highlighting the broader implications of the case. HOA overreach, unchecked authority, and the failure to respect historical protections were themes that resonated with audiences far beyond the immediate neighborhood. Social media debates flourished, with thousands of shares, comments, and discussions on the rights of homeowners versus the powers of homeowner associations. The story became a viral cautionary tale, a modern-day parable of bureaucratic arrogance clashing with civic responsibility and heritage preservation. The HOA attempted a variety of strategies to mitigate the fallout. They released statements apologizing for the oversight, claiming that they had acted in good faith but lacked awareness of the wall's landmark status. Internally, the board debated whether to offer compensation, attempt reconstruction, or quietly comply with the fines and hope the scandal faded. None of these options seemed sufficient. Reconstruction of the wall would be prohibitively expensive, complicated by the need to adhere to preservation guidelines, while compensation alone would do little to restore public trust or erase the damage. The board faced the realization that their authority had been permanently undermined. Their ability to enforce rules without scrutiny had been exposed as fragile, contingent on fear rather than legitimacy. Every past action that had gone unquestioned now appeared vulnerable to challenge, creating a climate of uncertainty and internal strife. As the investigation proceeded, city inspectors issued official orders requiring the HOA to halt any further demolition or alterations without proper review, under threat of additional penalties. The board scrambled to comply, but the damage was already done, and their reputation had suffered irreparably. Some members considered resigning, unwilling to endure the public scrutiny, financial liability, and potential personal lawsuits. Others sought to retain control, believing that conceding authority would be seen as weakness. This internal conflict created a chaotic environment, further destabilizing the HOA and weakening its ability to respond effectively. Elaine, observing the turmoil, felt a complicated mixture of vindication and sorrow. Her fight had succeeded in exposing negligence and enforcing accountability, but the personal loss of the wall remained. She began considering ways to not only recover her property, but also ensure that other historical structures in the neighborhood were protected from similar fate. Her efforts led to the formation of a neighborhood preservation committee, with volunteers documenting other historically significant features, ensuring compliance with city codes, and educating residents about their rights and protections. The committee became a model of grassroots civic engagement, turning a destructive incident into an opportunity for positive community organization. Meanwhile, the HOA financial situation worsened as fines continued to accrue, legal fees mounted, and insurance provided no relief. Some board members were forced to consider personal financial liability, realizing that their mismanagement could impact their own savings, homes, and futures. The realization that the consequences of their actions extended far beyond bureaucracy and budgets became a sobering wake-up call. The story reached a crescendo when a formal hearing was scheduled with city officials, legal representatives, and historical preservation authorities. The hearing promised to be a public spectacle, drawing media attention, neighborhood attendance, and expert testimony. The HOA, already fragile, faced a direct confrontation with the full weight of legal and civic authority. Elaine, prepared with meticulous documentation and expert reports, entered the proceedings with calm determination. The hearing revealed layers of negligence, miscommunication, and willful disregard for historical preservation. Inspectors detailed the exact violations, the city outlined fines, and legal experts explained the potential for additional civil actions. The HOA board members, some visibly shaken, attempted to defend their actions, but the evidence was overwhelming. The hearing concluded with the issuance of substantial fines, mandatory restoration orders, and a requirement for board members to undergo training on historical preservation compliance. The decisions sent shockwaves through the neighborhood and the HOA community at large, serving as a stark warning that authority exercised without knowledge or care could lead to devastating consequences. Elaine's perseverance had not only enforced accountability for her lost wall, but had also initiated broader change in the community. Residents now recognized the power of documentation, historical knowledge, and civic engagement. The HOA, weakened but still present, was forced to operate under stricter oversight and transparency, a direct result of the wall's destruction and Elaine's relentless advocacy. As the dust settled, Elaine reflected on the journey she had undertaken. What began as a personal tragedy, the loss of a beloved stone wall, had evolved into a powerful lesson in accountability, civic responsibility, and the enduring importance of heritage preservation. She understood that while the physical structure could never be fully restored to its original form, the community's awareness, engagement, and protection of historical landmarks had been irrevocably strengthened. The HOA, once confident in its unquestioned authority, had been humbled, forced to confront the consequences of negligence and arrogance. The story of the demolished stone wall became a defining moment, a cautionary tale of what happens when power is exercised blindly, and a testament to the impact that one determined individual could have in defending history and enforcing accountability. The neighborhood, energized by the events, embraced a new era of transparency, oversight, and civic responsibility. And though the wall itself lay in ruins, Elaine's fight had ensured that its legacy, significance, and lessons would endure far beyond the stones themselves, shaping the future of the community and serving as a reminder that heritage, diligence, and justice could prevail even against entrenched authority. The aftermath of the city hearing left the HOA board reeling, their confidence shattered and their finances teetering on the brink of disaster. Board members wandered the neighborhood with a sense of unease, fully aware that their mistakes had exposed them to scrutiny not only from residents, but also from legal authorities, media outlets, and preservation officials. The weight of the fines, legal fees, and mandatory restoration orders pressed heavily on their shoulders, creating a tense atmosphere that infiltrated every decision they made. What had once been a routine administrative role had transformed into a crisis management nightmare, and the veneer of authority that the board had long relied upon had all but evaporated. Internally, chaos dominated the HOA operations. Meetings that were previously perfunctory had become heated debates, each member scrambling to justify past decisions while fearing personal liability. Accusations flew like daggers, and alliances formed and dissolved within hours. Some board members, paralyzed by fear, refused to participate in discussions, hoping that inaction might shield them from further culpability. Others sought aggressive strategies to redirect blame onto administrative staff, contractors, or even Elaine herself, failing to recognize that the evidence was irrefutable. The board's email exchanges, now increasingly frantic and unfiltered, revealed not only incompetence but also panic and denial. One member admitted that they had ignored early warnings about the wall because it was easier to act than to research historical registries, a statement that would later come back to haunt them in legal proceedings. Another confessed to signing demolition orders without review, trusting in the authority of the board's decision-making hierarchy. The more Elaine uncovered, the more she realized that the HOA actions were not the result of a single misjudgment, but rather a systemic pattern of negligence, arrogance, and poor governance. Residents, once hesitant to challenge the board, now observed this unraveling with fascination and, in some cases, satisfaction. The destruction of the wall had ignited a shift in the neighborhood's power dynamics, empowering those who had long felt marginalized by the HOA's strict enforcement policies. Community meetings, once perfunctory gatherings, were now vibrant, heated forums where residents voiced grievances, demanded accountability, and questioned enforcement practices. Elaine, though personally focused on her own case, became an inadvertent leader of this growing movement. Her meticulous documentation, legal knowledge, and visibility through media coverage provided both a blueprint and inspiration for neighbors seeking to assert their rights. Discussions at these meetings often revolved around the broader implications of the HOA actions, the abuse of authority, the need for transparency, and the importance of protecting historical and personal property. The board, sensing the rising tide of unrest, attempted damage control. They issued statements expressing regret, pledging to comply with all legal directives, and promising to implement internal oversight measures. Internally, however, these statements were hollow. Board members debated the feasibility of reconstructing the wall, recognizing that the cost, complexity, and adherence to preservation standards made the project daunting. The conversation shifted to financial survival, how to manage fines, legal fees, and potential lawsuits without plunging the association into bankruptcy. Yet every strategy they devised revealed the fragility of their position. The city inspectors, guided by Elaine's documentation and expert testimonies, monitored the HOA compliance with strict scrutiny. Each misstep, delay, or deviation from mandated procedures risked additional fines and penalties. The board's inability to function cohesively under this pressure exacerbated the problem, creating a cycle of poor decisions, legal exposure, and growing neighborhood dissatisfaction. As weeks passed, the personal stakes for individual board members became increasingly clear. Some realized that their own assets could be targeted if the HOA could not cover the financial liabilities. Fear and anxiety became constants, eroding cohesion and amplifying mistakes. The realization that negligence had personal consequences was a harsh awakening. Positions once seen as symbolic or administrative now carried real-world risk. Meanwhile, Elaine pursued additional avenues to ensure accountability. She met with historical preservation experts, urban planners, and legal advisors to determine the most effective methods for compelling the HOA to restore not just the wall, but its historical integrity. Every suggestion, from reconstruction using original methods to full replication with modern reinforcements, was meticulously documented and submitted to the city. Elaine understood that the legal and bureaucratic battles would be lengthy, but she remained determined to prevent similar violations from occurring in the future. The community, emboldened by Elaine's leadership and the unfolding scandal, began organizing preservation efforts beyond her own property. Residents identified other historically significant structures, documented their condition, and petitioned for protective status where possible. These grassroots efforts marked a dramatic cultural shift in the neighborhood, turning fear into vigilance and passive compliance into active engagement. The HOA, already weakened, struggled to manage this new reality. Their once unquestioned authority was now openly challenged, with residents holding them accountable for even minor infractions. The board's meetings became public spectacles, attended by residents who demanded transparency, documentation, and justification for every decision. What had been private deliberations were now forums of accountability, and the HOA capacity to enforce rules without oversight had been permanently diminished. Financial pressures intensified. Fines for the demolition alone were substantial, and legal fees continued to mount. The board explored every possible option for mitigating costs, seeking external funding, appealing fines, or negotiating with the city for leniency. However, each avenue revealed new challenges, including legal precedent, statutory requirements, and public scrutiny. The HOA precarious position became a cautionary tale of governance, missteps, negligence, and arrogance. Elaine, while monitoring the financial collapse, remained focused on principles rather than personal gain. Her objective was accountability, restoration, and neighborhood reform. She facilitated workshops for residents, highlighting legal rights, preservation responsibilities, and the dangers of unchecked administrative authority. Her efforts transformed her role from a single homeowner fighting for justice to a catalyst for systemic change in the community. Public attention remained intense. News outlets continued to cover the ongoing fallout, emphasizing the lessons to be learned from the HOA reckless behavior. Social media amplified these stories, with posts analyzing legal documents, sharing photos of the demolished wall, and debating the ethics of HOA enforcement. Elaine's meticulous documentation became a primary source for journalists, lending credibility and depth to every story. The narrative resonated far beyond the neighborhood, raising questions about the balance of power between residents and homeowners associations nationwide. Inside the HOA, panic reached new heights as board members faced personal confrontations with residents, media inquiries, and ongoing legal challenges. Meetings frequently ended in stalemates, with heated debates over how to respond to mounting obligations. Some members advocated for aggressive litigation against Elaine or other residents, attempting to shift blame, while others sought to comply fully with restoration orders and fines, acknowledging that their previous actions had been reckless and unlawful. The inability to unite on strategy only deepened the crisis, illustrating that negligence had consequences beyond mere monetary penalties. It had fractured the board's internal cohesion. The story of the stone wall also inspired broader civic engagement in the city. Local preservation societies cited the case as a prime example of why vigilance and enforcement of historical protection laws were necessary. Other homeowners associations were prompted to review their own policies, verifying that structures of historical significance were properly documented and protected. Elaine's fight became a template for residents nationwide seeking to hold governing bodies accountable, transforming a personal tragedy into a movement for civic responsibility. As the HOA struggled under mounting fines, the threat of personal liability, and eroded authority, Elaine continued her work to ensure that historical integrity was prioritized. She coordinated with city officials, historians, and architects to draft a plan for partial reconstruction and preservation. This plan emphasized accuracy, adherence to landmark regulations, and community engagement, ensuring that lessons were learned and applied beyond her immediate property. The board, meanwhile, oscillated between compliance and denial. Attempts to minimize public exposure, downplay fines, or avoid restoration only exacerbated scrutiny. Residents demanded transparency, legal authorities imposed stricter oversight, and media coverage ensured that every misstep was documented, The once quiet neighborhood had become a battleground of accountability, governance, and civic pride. As the weeks turned into months, the HOA internal conflicts became public knowledge, further undermining their credibility. Leaked emails, meeting notes, and testimonies painted a picture of an organization unprepared for its responsibilities, willing to prioritize expediency over legality and blind to the value of heritage. Residents, inspired by Elaine's leadership, advocated for long-term reforms, including mandatory historical reviews for all construction, enhanced communication channels between board and residents, and the creation of oversight committees to monitor enforcement practices. The HOA, weakened but still in existence, faced the reality that their authority would never be the same. Elaine, while personally gratified by the progress, remained mindful of the work ahead. Restoration of the stone wall was a complex endeavor requiring skilled craftsmanship, historical accuracy, and ongoing monitoring. Legal battles were ongoing, and the threat of additional fines or civil action lingered over the board members. Yet the transformation of the neighborhood's culture, from passive compliance to active civic engagement, offered hope that the tragedy of the wall's destruction could produce lasting positive change. By the end of this phase, it was clear that the HOA had been humbled. Their previous arrogance had been replaced with caution, oversight, and a reluctant acknowledgement of resident power. Elaine had not only protected her own interests, but had catalyzed a broader movement to safeguard historical structures and enforce accountability. The stone wall, though destroyed, had become a symbol of the dangers of unchecked authority, of the resilience of residents willing to fight for justice, and of the transformative potential of civic engagement. The neighborhood, forever altered by these events, was entering a new chapter, one in which history, responsibility, and oversight were no longer optional, and in which residents like Elaine would ensure that the mistakes of the past were neither forgotten nor repeated. The HOA mounting desperation became palpable as the financial reality of their decisions settled over the board like a storm cloud. Every meeting seemed to bring new revelations of unpaid fines, growing legal fees, and the looming threat of personal liability for individual board members. The city's insistence on restitution for the demolished stone wall had not only revealed the HOA incompetence, but also highlighted the fragility of their entire financial structure. What had once been a routine, almost ceremonial administrative responsibility now felt like a sinking ship, each misstep threatening to pull them further into financial ruin. As the deadlines imposed by the city's Historical Preservation Office loomed, the board scrambled to find funds to cover the escalating penalties. Attempts to levy additional fees on residents were met with immediate backlash. Homeowners, empowered by Elaine's leadership and the growing media attention, refused to comply with new charges, arguing that the board had brought this crisis upon themselves. Some even filed formal complaints questioning the legality of imposing further fees, citing the HOA gross negligence as a mitigating factor. The board's inability to collect additional revenue exposed an uncomfortable truth. Their authority was not unlimited, and their previous assumption that residents would comply without question was catastrophically wrong. Panic and blame circulated freely among the board members. One member suggested liquidating HOA assets, including landscaping equipment and maintenance vehicles, to cover fines, while another floated the idea of taking out high-interest loans. The urgency of the situation heightened tensions, transforming meetings into arenas of frustration, finger-pointing, and fear. Emails sent between board members revealed deep fractures, as individuals attempted to shield themselves from liability by placing blame on others, including administrative staff and contractors. The personal stakes were enormous. Some board members began fearing that if the HOA failed to meet its financial obligations, their personal assets could be at risk. The realization that their negligence could have direct consequences for their homes, savings, and credit shook the group, leaving some paralyzed with indecision while others acted impulsively, further compounding the chaos. Meanwhile, Elaine continued to navigate the complex interplay of legal, historical, and civic dimensions with precision. She had engaged restoration experts, historians, and architects, to design a plan for reconstructing the wall in a manner consistent with historical standards. Their assessments were meticulous, detailing every stone, joint, and mortar composition, ensuring that the wall could be rebuilt authentically. Elaine submitted these proposals to the city, framing them as part of a broader effort to restore not only her property, but also the neighborhood's historical integrity. The city, impressed by the thoroughness and diligence of the documentation, approved portions of the restoration plan, making it clear that the HOA would be responsible for overseeing compliance with every technical detail. This added another layer of complexity for the board, as they now faced not only financial obligations, but also logistical responsibilities they were ill-prepared to handle. Attempts to find shortcuts, use cheaper materials, or delegate oversight to unqualified contractors were immediately rejected by the city, with officials emphasizing that any deviation from the approved restoration plan could result in additional fines or legal action. The pressure on the HOA intensified further as media coverage continued. Local news outlets highlighted the ongoing struggle, portraying the board as an organization in crisis, incapable of managing even minor administrative responsibilities without catastrophic consequences. Social media amplified the story, with posts analyzing the board's internal emails, debating the ethics of HOA governance, and documenting neighborhood activism. Residents who had previously been silent were emboldened to participate in meetings, demand accountability, and share their own grievances. Elaine's careful documentation and public visibility transformed her from a single homeowner into a central figure in a neighborhood movement that challenged entrenched authority. As public attention mounted, the HOA board realized that their options were narrowing. Litigation against Elaine or attempts to shift blame had been considered and dismissed by legal counsel, who warned that such strategies would almost certainly backfire given the overwhelming evidence against the board. Instead, the board attempted to negotiate with the city, seeking extensions on deadlines, reductions in fines, and leniency on restoration requirements. These negotiations were partially successful in delaying immediate financial collapse, but did little to restore public trust or alleviate internal tensions. Residents continued to monitor every move, attending meetings in record numbers and demanding transparency. The neighborhood had transformed into a site of civic engagement, with Elaine at the center, guiding discussions, providing documentation, and advocating for strict adherence to preservation standards. The HOA, meanwhile, struggled to maintain order, with internal meetings increasingly dominated by arguments over financial strategy, legal interpretation, and risk management. Some board members advocated for a wait-and-see approach, hoping the media attention would fade, while others argued for immediate compliance with all city directives to minimize further legal exposure. The tension between these factions created paralysis, and each decision carried enormous consequences. Within the community, the story of the stone wall had become emblematic of broader issues surrounding HOA governance, resident rights, and historical preservation. Residents who had long chafed under strict, often arbitrary rules now recognized the importance of oversight and civic engagement. Small acts of resistance, documenting property conditions, questioning board decisions, attending meetings, and sharing information, became routine. Elaine's example demonstrated that individual vigilance, combined with careful documentation and legal awareness, could reshape power dynamics in ways previously unimagined. Restoration efforts for the wall were complicated and slow. Specialists carefully cataloged each remaining stone, photographing and measuring them to ensure proper replacement. Materials had to be sourced to match the original composition and appearance, and skilled craftsmen were required to follow preservation standards. Every step required careful documentation and city approval, adding layers of complexity and cost. The HOA, charged with oversight, struggled to coordinate these efforts. Board members were inexperienced in construction, preservation law, and project management, making compliance a logistical nightmare. Delays, miscommunications, and errors were common, and each misstep risked additional fines or public criticism. Legal experts warned that failure to follow approved restoration procedures precisely could result in escalated penalties, personal liability for board members, or even criminal charges in extreme cases. The city monitored progress closely, insisting on detailed reports, photographs, and regular inspections. The HOA, unaccustomed to such scrutiny, found the process exhausting, frustrating, and demoralizing. Meanwhile, Elaine continued to assert her influence constructively. She coordinated restoration timelines, ensured experts were consulted on every decision, and communicated with residents about progress and obstacles. Her efforts provided a model of accountability and diligence, demonstrating that enforcement and preservation could coexist when guided by knowledge, expertise, and ethical responsibility. The HOA credibility, once untouchable, was now irreparably damaged. Residents questioned every prior decision, scrutinized enforcement actions, and demanded oversight. Some longtime board members faced public criticism at neighborhood meetings, with their competence and judgment openly challenged. Trust, once assumed, had to be rebuilt through transparent communication, adherence to regulations, and genuine engagement with the community. Financial strain remained an ongoing concern. Fines for demolition, legal fees, and costs associated with restoration were substantial, and the board's attempts to mitigate them through loans, asset liquidation, or revenue generation were met with mixed results. The prospect of personal liability loomed large for some members who had signed off on demolition orders without due diligence. Anxiety, stress, and fear dominated board discussions, and cohesion had all but disappeared. Even small operational decisions required careful consideration, as mistakes could carry outsized consequences. Elaine, meanwhile, turned her attention to broader neighborhood reforms. She organized informational sessions on homeowner rights, historical preservation requirements, and proper procedures for submitting and reviewing construction or alteration requests. She emphasized the importance of documentation, civic engagement, and collaboration with city authorities to prevent future incidents like the stone wall's destruction. Residents responded enthusiastically, seeing in Elaine's leadership both protection for their own property and a model for meaningful engagement with governance structures. Media coverage continued to frame the HOA struggles as a cautionary tale, highlighting the consequences of arrogance, negligence, and the failure to respect both history and resident rights. Social media posts shared timelines of events, photographs of the wall before and after demolition, and commentary on the HOA internal collapse. The story resonated beyond the neighborhood, inspiring conversations about HOA accountability and the protection of historical landmarks across the city and region. As the restoration progressed, the HOA faced scrutiny not only from city authorities, but also from residents and experts monitoring the project's adherence to approved plans. Every stone had to be placed correctly, every joint and mortar composition verified, and progress meticulously documented. Mistakes could result in additional penalties, reputational damage, and prolonged legal exposure. The process was slow, expensive, and fraught with complexity, forcing the board to confront the full consequences of their initial negligence. By the end of this period, the HOA had been fundamentally altered. Their authority was diminished, their credibility questioned, and their internal cohesion fractured. The neighborhood had emerged empowered, informed, and engaged. Elaine, though personally affected by the loss of her wall, had transformed a destructive incident into a catalyst for accountability, reform, and civic action. The stone wall, once destroyed in a moment of reckless authority, was slowly being reconstructed, its legacy preserved through careful oversight, legal compliance, and community involvement. And while the process was far from complete, the lessons learned had reshaped the neighborhood's culture, governance, and sense of responsibility, creating a model for transparency, engagement, and the protection of historical heritage for years to come. The reconstruction of Elaine's stone wall became the focal point of the neighborhood, an ongoing symbol of both the HOA failures and the community's resilience. Every day, workers carefully placed stones, adhering to the precise measurements, mortar compositions, and patterns specified by preservation experts. Each stone removed during the demolition had been catalogued, photographed, and measured, ensuring that the restored wall would reflect the craftsmanship of its original builders. Elaine remained vigilant throughout the process, overseeing each phase with meticulous attention to detail. She coordinated between contractors, historians, and city inspectors, making certain that the restoration adhered to every legal and aesthetic requirement. The process was slow and painstaking, but the community watched with fascination and growing respect for her dedication. Neighbors would often stop by, observing the progress and occasionally offering help or resources, further reinforcing the sense that this project belonged to the community as much as it did to Elaine. The HOA, meanwhile, remained trapped in a state of unease. Their financial obligations continued to mount, exacerbated by the ongoing costs of oversight, restoration coordination, and fines. Attempts to recover through loans or additional fees met with resistance and scrutiny from both residents and the city. The board members, many of whom had never faced serious financial or legal consequences before, were now confronted with the stark reality of personal liability. Some members secretly considered resignation, unwilling to endure the prolonged public scrutiny and potential financial disaster. Others tried to assert authority, but their credibility had been irreparably damaged. The internal chaos of the board became more pronounced as the reconstruction progressed. Meetings frequently devolved into arguments over strategy, timelines, and budget allocation. Some members attempted to micromanage contractors despite lacking expertise, while others advocated for outsourcing oversight to consultants, an option complicated by both city regulations and escalating costs. Accusations of incompetence, negligence, and personal bias circulated in emails and private discussions, further destabilizing the board's cohesion. Elaine, in contrast, moved with clarity and purpose. Her approach was methodical and grounded in expertise, combining historical preservation knowledge with project management skills. She documented every step of the reconstruction process, taking photographs, recording notes, and maintaining a detailed timeline that would later serve as evidence of compliance and diligence. Her leadership provided a stark contrast to the HOA panicked inefficiency, further eroding their standing in the eyes of residents and officials alike. The neighborhood's engagement intensified as the reconstruction continued. Residents began documenting their own properties, ensuring that any historically significant structures were protected and cataloged. Informal committees were formed, tasked with monitoring HOA actions, reviewing permits, and providing guidance to neighbors facing disputes or enforcement issues. The story of the stone wall had sparked a movement, transforming previously passive residents into active participants in community governance. Local media continued to follow the project, broadcasting updates on the wall's progress and highlighting the ongoing consequences of the HOA negligence. Social media amplified these reports, creating a ripple effect that extended beyond the neighborhood, inspiring homeowners in other communities to question HOA authority and prioritize historical preservation. The HOA public image suffered significantly. Attempts to issue statements expressing regret or promising reforms were met with skepticism, and residents frequently challenged them at meetings, demanding transparency, accountability, and proof of compliance. The board's inability to regain control over the narrative further reinforced the perception of incompetence, and their previous aura of authority was replaced by a mixture of fear, defensiveness, and desperation. As reconstruction progressed, technical challenges emerged. Some stones had been irreparably damaged, requiring the sourcing of historically accurate replacements. Mortar formulations had to be adjusted to match original compositions, and craftsmen had to carefully replicate patterns that had been lost in the demolition. Each step required meticulous oversight, with inspectors verifying adherence to approved standards. The process underscored the complexity of historical preservation and the costs of the HOA initial negligence. Financially, the HOA struggled to meet obligations. Legal fees continued to mount. City imposed fines accumulated, and restoration oversight added another layer of expense. Board members debated whether to liquidate additional assets, seek emergency funding, or appeal specific fines. Each option carried risks, further complicating an already precarious situation. The personal stakes were high, as some board members faced the possibility of being held personally liable for decisions made without due diligence. The pressure created tension not only within the board but also among residents, who monitored every action, ensuring compliance and transparency. Elaine's role evolved as the reconstruction continued. She became a mediator between contractors, city officials, and residents, ensuring that restoration met both legal and historical standards while maintaining open communication. Her leadership emphasized collaboration and accountability, providing a template for effective governance that contrasted sharply with the HOA prior mismanagement. Residents increasingly viewed Elaine as a guardian of neighborhood heritage, a voice of reason, and a catalyst for civic engagement. The completed sections of the wall began to take shape, and each milestone was celebrated quietly by the community. Photographs circulated on social media, highlighting the careful restoration and the contrast between the wall's previous destruction and its rebirth. The project became a visual representation of accountability, resilience, and the importance of preserving cultural heritage. In the meantime, the HOA attempted various strategies to recover credibility and financial stability. Public relations campaigns, internal audits, and policy reforms were proposed, but these efforts were met with skepticism by residents and city officials alike. The board's previous missteps had left a lasting impression, and every action was scrutinized closely. Attempts to regain authority without addressing past negligence were largely ineffective, underscoring the lesson that trust, once broken, must be rebuilt through consistent, transparent, and accountable actions. Legal considerations continued to dominate the board's agenda. City inspectors maintained oversight of restoration efforts, reviewing contracts, materials, and timelines to ensure compliance. Additional fines were threatened for any deviation from approved procedures, creating a high-pressure environment that compounded the HOA internal tensions. Consultants and legal advisors provided guidance, but the board's lack of expertise in construction and historical preservation made coordination difficult. The process highlighted the consequences of acting without knowledge, planning, or due diligence, reinforcing the broader lessons of accountability and governance. The neighborhood itself had undergone a transformation. Residents who had once relied solely on the HOA for guidance and enforcement were now active participants in oversight, documentation, and advocacy. Informal networks of communication emerged, sharing information about historical structures, enforcement actions, and community initiatives. The story of the stone wall became a reference point for discussions about governance, responsibility, and civic engagement. Elaine's meticulous documentation and visible leadership inspired residents to take an active role in protecting their properties and the neighborhood's heritage. Social and media attention intensified as the reconstruction neared completion. Local reporters highlighted the progress of the wall, the challenges of restoration, and the ongoing consequences for the HOA. Social media posts documenting each phase of reconstruction went viral, reinforcing Elaine's role as a community leader and emphasizing the importance of accountability in HOA governance. The story resonated widely, inspiring homeowners and community advocates to question authority, prioritize historical preservation, and insist on transparency in local governance. As the wall neared its restored form, subtle changes in the HOA operations became evident. Board meetings became more structured, oversight procedures were implemented, and a cautious approach replaced the previous culture of arbitrary enforcement. Residents, still wary, continued to monitor actions closely, attending meetings, reviewing communications, and participating in committees focused on historical preservation. The HOA, humbled by the process, had begun to accept the limits of their authority and the importance of collaboration with the community they served. By the time reconstruction was largely complete, the wall stood as a testament not only to historical craftsmanship, but also to resilience, accountability, and the power of community engagement. Each stone represented the painstaking efforts of experts, the dedication of Elaine, and the vigilance of residents determined to protect their heritage. The HOA, once arrogant and unchallenged, had been transformed through consequences, oversight, and public scrutiny. Residents had gained a new sense of empowerment, understanding that active participation, documentation, and civic engagement were essential to maintaining both property rights and neighborhood heritage. Elaine reflected on the journey, aware that the stone wall's restoration symbolized more than physical reconstruction. It represented the triumph of diligence, knowledge, and persistence over negligence and authoritarianism. The neighborhood had shifted fundamentally, embracing transparency, oversight, and a collective sense of responsibility that would shape its governance for years to come. The HOA, financially strained but operationally reformed, faced a long road to restoring credibility and trust. The board had learned, through hard lessons, that authority without accountability was fragile, and that history, law, and community engagement could not be ignored without consequence. Elaine's leadership ensured that these lessons would endure, providing a model for responsible governance, historical preservation, and civic participation. And so, as the last stones were carefully placed and the restoration project concluded, the neighborhood entered a new chapter, one in which heritage was protected, authority was accountable, and residents had reclaimed a sense of agency and pride. The stone wall, once destroyed through arrogance and negligence, now stood restored, a symbol of resilience, vigilance, and the enduring importance of preserving both history and the principles of responsible community governance. By the time the reconstruction of Elaine's stone wall was well underway, the HOA board found itself in uncharted territory. The full magnitude of their misjudgment had crystallized into a combination of legal, financial, and reputational crises that seemed impossible to navigate. Board members, once confident in their authority, were now haunted by the consequences of a single reckless decision. A decision that had not only destroyed a piece of local history, but had shaken the very foundation of their governance. Each day brought new reminders of their failure. Fines continued to accumulate, legal counsel demanded extensive consultation, and the city maintained rigorous oversight over every step of the restoration process. The board's internal meetings, once perfunctory and uncontentious, had evolved into high-stakes sessions dominated by panic, blame, and fractured leadership. Some members, overwhelmed by the financial implications, considered resignation, recognizing that their personal liability could extend beyond the association's coffers. Others clung stubbornly to the illusion of control, hoping to salvage authority through procedural maneuvers, public statements, or strategic delays. Yet every action, or inaction, served only to highlight the board's vulnerability and deepen public scrutiny. Elaine, observing the board's unraveling, remained methodical and resolute. Her focus was on accountability, historical preservation, and community engagement. She coordinated with contractors to ensure adherence to restoration plans, consulted with historians to maintain historical accuracy, and meticulously documented every interaction with the HOA and city officials. Her visibility, combined with her calm authority, further contrasted with the board's panic and disorganization, amplifying their sense of inadequacy. The neighborhood, energized by the unfolding events, took on an unprecedented role in monitoring the HOA. Residents attended every meeting, scrutinized every decision, and raised questions about past enforcement actions. Informal committees formed to oversee compliance with preservation laws, document property conditions, and advocate for transparency. This collective vigilance highlighted the extent to which the HOA had relied on fear, bureaucracy, and assumed authority to maintain control. The board, once feared, now found itself under constant observation, every misstep recorded, analyzed, and disseminated. The media continued to amplify the story. Local news segments highlighted the ongoing reconstruction, chronicled the board's mismanagement, and emphasized the legal and financial consequences of their actions. Social media posts, some shared thousands of times, dissected internal emails, analyzed financial statements, and celebrated the meticulous restoration of the wall. Elaine's role as a community leader became increasingly visible, positioning her not only as a homeowner seeking justice, but as a symbol of accountability and civic engagement. The HOA, recognizing the intensity of scrutiny, attempted multiple strategies to regain credibility. Public statements of remorse were issued, promises of internal reforms were circulated, and attempts were made to highlight positive community projects unrelated to the wall. Yet these efforts were largely ineffective. Residents and city officials saw them as too little, too late. The board's previous arrogance had eroded trust, and the public spectacle ensured that any attempt at image rehabilitation would be met with skepticism and ongoing scrutiny. Financial stress became an even more pressing concern. The combination of fines, restoration oversight costs, and mounting legal fees threatened to bankrupt the association. The board explored options such as emergency loans, insurance claims, and asset liquidation, but each approach revealed limitations. Insurance policies did not cover willful negligence, emergency loans carried high interest, and liquidation of assets could only provide partial relief. Individual board members feared that, if the association defaulted, personal assets could be pursued to cover debts, introducing a new dimension of anxiety and internal conflict. Meanwhile, the restoration project moved forward under the watchful eye of both city inspectors and Elaine. Every detail, from stone selection to mortar composition, was carefully reviewed. Contractors were held to rigorous standards, and deviations from approved methods were immediately flagged. The process, painstakingly slow, underscored the importance of expertise, planning, and adherence to legal and historical requirement, elements that the HOA had completely ignored during the initial demolition. As reconstruction progressed, the HOA board grappled with the dual reality of financial insolvency and eroded authority. Internal communications revealed fractures between members who advocated for compliance and those who sought to shift blame. Arguments erupted over procedural decisions, timelines, and cost management, exposing not only incompetence but also fear-driven indecision. The board's inability to act cohesively compounded their exposure to additional fines and further scrutiny. Elaine's leadership extended beyond her own property. She organized informational sessions for residents on historical preservation, legal protections, and HOA governance. Her efforts empowered neighbors to actively monitor enforcement, challenge arbitrary fines, and participate in community decision-making. The neighborhood's transformation was profound. Once passive, residents now engaged directly with governance, prioritizing accountability and preservation over unquestioning compliance. Legal consequences for the board intensified. City inspectors issued detailed reports outlining continued noncompliance, incomplete documentation, and mismanagement of restoration oversight. Each report was meticulously cross-referenced with internal HOA records, highlighting discrepancies and further eroding credibility. The fines, already substantial, were augmented by penalties for delays, errors, and repeated violations, creating a financial burden that the board could neither easily manage nor ignore. Some residents considered civil suits for damages beyond the wall, citing emotional distress, disruption, and negligence. These possibilities loomed over the board, amplifying anxiety and complicating decision-making. Media coverage reached a peak during this period, portraying the HOA as emblematic of unchecked authority gone awry. Interviews with historians, legal experts, and residents framed the story as both a cautionary tale and a testament to civic vigilance. Elaine, consistently prepared and calm, became a credible spokesperson, providing insight into the historical, legal, and community dimensions of the case. Social media amplified the narrative, with thousands of shares and commentary highlighting the consequences of the board's actions. The HOA internal turmoil continued unabated. Some members advocated for immediate resignation, hoping to shield themselves from financial liability and public scrutiny. Others pushed for aggressive strategies to regain control, such as attempting to expedite restoration, negotiating reduced fines, or limiting resident access to meetings. These strategies, however, often conflicted, creating stalemates and further demonstrating the board's inability to operate effectively. As the restoration neared completion, the neighborhood's collective engagement became increasingly formalized. Committees were established to monitor historical preservation compliance, review board decisions, and advise on policy changes. Residents developed detailed documentation protocols, ensuring that any future disputes could be addressed with evidence rather than speculation. Elaine's role as an organizer and leader became institutionalized, her diligence serving as a model for neighbor-led oversight and accountability. The HOA attempts to assert authority were met with immediate resistance. Residents questioned enforcement actions, demanded documentation, and highlighted past mistakes. Meetings became arenas for accountability rather than compliance, with every decision scrutinized by an informed and empowered community. The board's prior reliance on fear and assumed authority was rendered obsolete, forcing a cultural shift in governance. Personal consequences for board members became increasingly apparent. Some faced inquiries regarding potential mismanagement, negligence, and breach of fiduciary duty. Others were concerned that the mounting fines and legal exposure could extend to personal assets. Anxiety and tension dominated internal discussions, creating a climate of uncertainty and fear that permeated every aspect of the HOA operations. Elaine, while maintaining focus on restoration, recognized the importance of systemic change. She advocated for formal policy reforms, including mandatory historical reviews, transparent documentation of enforcement actions, and increased resident engagement in decision-making. These reforms, she argued, would prevent future disasters and create a culture of accountability and vigilance. By the end of this period, the HOA was fundamentally altered. Their authority had been diminished, their credibility undermined, and their internal cohesion fractured. The neighborhood had emerged empowered, vigilant, and organized, with residents actively participating in oversight and preservation. Elaine's leadership, combined with the rigorous enforcement of historical preservation standards, had transformed a destructive incident into a lasting movement for accountability and civic engagement. The stone wall, nearing completion, stood as a symbol of resilience, persistence, and the consequences of negligence. Each stone represented careful planning, community oversight, and a commitment to preserving heritage. The HOA, financially strained and operationally humbled, faced a long road to restoring trust. Board members understood that authority without accountability was fragile, and that negligence could have cascading consequences beyond what they had imagined. Elaine's efforts ensured that the lessons of the stone wall's destruction would endure, creating a model of responsible governance, resident empowerment, and historical preservation. As the neighborhood looked on, the reconstructed wall became more than a physical restoration. It was a testament to the power of vigilance, accountability, and collective action. The HOA, once arrogant and unchallenged, had been fundamentally transformed by the events they had set in motion, and the neighborhood had reclaimed both agency and pride. The story of the wall, the reconstruction, and the board's downfall became an enduring example of the consequences of negligence, the importance of oversight, and the capacity of an informed community to effect lasting change. By the time the last stones were carefully set into place, the stone wall stood restored to its historical glory, a tangible testament to perseverance, meticulous planning, and the power of accountability. The neighborhood, which had once felt trapped under the overreach of an indifferent HOA, now stood transformed. Residents gathered quietly at the edge of the property, observing the completion of the project with a sense of shared accomplishment. The wall's careful reconstruction was not merely an aesthetic restoration. It symbolized the community reclaiming authority, asserting rights, and ensuring that negligence could no longer prevail unchecked. Elaine, who had overseen every detail, felt a complex mix of satisfaction and lingering sorrow. The wall itself, once a familiar structure in the landscape of her home, had been torn down, desecrated, and partially lost. Yet its resurrection under stringent historical standards had re-established a sense of justice. Every stone, every carefully recreated joint, every historically accurate mortar blend was proof that vigilance and persistence could overcome even institutional arrogance. The HOA, meanwhile, faced the full culmination of the consequences of their recklessness. Fines imposed by the city for demolishing a registered landmark had reached staggering totals, and legal fees, consultant costs, and ongoing restoration oversight created a financial quagmire from which there was no easy escape. Board members, many of whom had underestimated the personal stakes of their decisions, realized that their tenure would forever be defined by the disaster of the stone wall. Some faced the real possibility of personal financial exposure, particularly those who had signed off on demolition orders without due diligence. The city's legal department issued final rulings that left little room for maneuver, emphasizing that negligence and willful disregard for historical protections could not be excused by ignorance. The HOA, which had once wielded authority with impunity, was now a cautionary tale of mismanagement, hubris, and the importance of accountability. As news outlets covered the completion of the wall, the narrative had shifted definitively. Elaine was portrayed not as a litigious homeowner, but as a community advocate, a protector of heritage, and a symbol of civic responsibility. Stories highlighted her meticulous documentation, collaboration with experts, and leadership in organizing neighborhood oversight. Social media buzzed with comparisons between the chaotic, panicked HOA and the organized, methodical efforts that had restored the wall. Elaine's influence extended beyond the single neighborhood, inspiring homeowners in other communities to assert their rights, document historically significant structures, and participate actively in local governance. The reconstruction project had also catalyzed enduring reforms within the neighborhood. Residents had formed formal committees tasked with monitoring HOA compliance, reviewing construction and alteration requests, and documenting properties of historical significance. Policies were established for transparent communication between residents and board members, ensuring that future disputes could be addressed before escalating into legal crises. Informational workshops led by Elaine and other community advocates taught homeowners about historical preservation requirements, legal protections, and effective methods of civic engagement. The neighborhood's culture had shifted, passive compliance was replaced with vigilance, and authority was tempered by oversight and accountability. For the HOA, the path forward was uncertain and fraught with ongoing challenges. Trust, once broken, required years to rebuild. The board implemented policy reforms, procedural reviews, and stricter oversight of enforcement actions. But the legacy of the stone wall's demolition remained. Residents scrutinized every decision, and the HOA authority was forever constrained by the knowledge that neglect could lead to public humiliation, legal consequences, and financial disaster. Internal dynamics among board members were permanently altered. Some resigned quietly, unwilling to endure ongoing scrutiny, while others remained, attempting to navigate the complex new reality of accountable governance. The board's operations, once insular and unchallenged, were now transparent, deliberate, and carefully monitored. Every decision carried weight, and mistakes were costly, creating a cautious environment in which authority was exercised with humility and oversight. Elaine's own role evolved into a sustained position of leadership within the community. Beyond her home and the wall she had fought to restore, she became a mentor and advocate for residents navigating HOA disputes, historical preservation regulations, and civic engagement processes. Her leadership emphasized collaboration, informed oversight, and respect for both law and heritage. The narrative of her fight became an educational tool for homeowners across the city, demonstrating that vigilance, documentation, and persistence could successfully challenge institutional overreach. Financially, the HOA remained burdened by fines and costs incurred during the reconstruction and legal proceedings. However, the community's engagement and increased transparency provided mechanisms to prevent further catastrophic mismanagement. Residents monitored budgets, reviewed contracts, and held board members accountable for every expenditure. The HOA operations became a model of cautious, responsible governance, albeit but one permanently marked by the consequences of prior negligence. The neighborhood, empowered by the events surrounding the stone wall, embraced broader civic initiatives. Community meetings became forums for discussion, collaboration, and oversight. Residents actively participated in decision-making, engaged in preservation efforts, and established long-term monitoring programs to protect historical landmarks. The wall's reconstruction, once a singular project, had catalyzed a lasting culture of accountability, vigilance, and civic responsibility. In the aftermath, Elaine reflected on the journey she had undertaken. The destruction of her stone wall had begun as a personal violation, a confrontation with an overreaching HOA that acted without knowledge or care. The ensuing legal, financial, and social struggles revealed the fragility of institutional authority when exercised recklessly. Yet through determination, meticulous planning, and collaboration with experts and neighbors, the wall had been restored and the neighborhood transformed. The lessons extended far beyond the physical reconstruction. Residents had learned the importance of documentation, oversight, and advocacy. The HOA had learned the high cost of negligence, the limits of assumed authority, and the necessity of transparent, accountable governance. Historical preservation, once a peripheral concern, became central to neighborhood planning and oversight. The restored wall itself stood as a monument to these lessons. Its stones, carefully placed according to historical specifications, reflected both the craftsmanship of the original builders and the diligence of those who had reconstructed it. The wall's presence was a constant reminder of the importance of vigilance, the power of community engagement, and the consequences of neglecting both law and heritage. For the HOA board, the wall was both a symbol of their failure and a benchmark for recovery. Every decision made thereafter was weighed against the lessons learned from the demolition and reconstruction. Policies, procedures, and communications were revised to prevent future disasters. Internal oversight mechanisms were strengthened, and the board operated under an unprecedented level of scrutiny. Their authority remained intact in a formal sense, but the perception of invulnerability had been shattered forever. Social and civic implications extended beyond the immediate neighborhood. Homeowners associations citywide took notice of the story, with many reassessing policies, enforcement practices, and historical preservation oversight. The narrative of Elaine's fight became a reference point in discussions of governance, resident rights, and heritage protection. Neighborhoods previously complacent about HOA authority now considered strategies for monitoring enforcement, documenting property conditions, and advocating for transparency. The story of the stone wall, once a personal loss, had grown into a citywide example of accountability and civic empowerment. As the neighborhood settled into this new era of oversight and engagement, subtle changes in daily life became evident. Residents felt empowered to question board decisions, attend meetings, and participate actively in governance. The culture of fear and passive compliance that had allowed the wall's demolition to occur had dissipated, replaced by informed vigilance and collective responsibility. The HOA, humbled and cautious, adapted to this new reality, understanding that trust was earned through transparency, diligence, and respect for both residents and historical heritage. Elaine herself remained vigilant, aware that the fight was not over merely because the wall had been reconstructed. She continued to monitor neighborhood initiatives, support preservation efforts, and educate residents about legal protections and proper channels for addressing HOA disputes. Her efforts ensured that the lessons learned from the wall's destruction would endure, fostering a long-term culture of accountability, civic engagement, and respect for historical heritage. By the time the dust had settled, the neighborhood had emerged stronger, wiser, and more cohesive. The stone wall stood as a physical testament to resilience, accountability, and the consequences of negligence. The HOA, forever altered by its own recklessness, had been humbled, forced to operate with transparency, diligence, and respect for both law and community. Residents had reclaimed authority and agency, ensuring that history, heritage, and property rights were protected for the future. The story of Elaine's fight against the HOA and the restoration of the stone wall became a defining narrative for the neighborhood. It illustrated the fragility of unchecked authority, the power of informed and organized citizens, and the enduring importance of preserving history. The neighborhood, forever marked by these events, had transformed from a place of passive compliance into a community defined by vigilance, collaboration, and empowerment. And as Elaine looked upon the completed wall, she understood that the physical restoration was only part of the legacy. The true victory lay in the lessons learned, the culture of accountability established, and the enduring vigilance of a community that refused to allow negligence and arrogance to go unchallenged. The stone wall, once destroyed through reckless authority, now stood as a monument not just to history, but to resilience, justice, and the transformative power of civic engagement. It was a reminder that even in the face of bureaucratic negligence and institutional arrogance, determination, diligence, and community solidarity could prevail. And with that enduring lesson, the neighborhood looked forward, forever changed, yet stronger, wiser, and more unified than ever before.